morning. Today is the 22nd day of Shvat, which is the yortzeit of the Kotzker Rebbe, and more recently, in 1988, the yortzeit of the Rebbe's wife, Chaya Mushka. And we're going to do quickly both the first and second readings of Parashat Mishpatim. So, and there's a lot of questions around the laws in this parsha. As its name implies, it's all about laws. So the laws that we have are sometimes confusing, especially to the more modern person. It starts off with what sounds like the laws of a Jewish slave, but that is a mistranslation. The correct translation is a bondman. A bondman is someone who owed money, for instance, and could not pay it back. And so he pays it back by working for the people that he owed. That's one option. The other option is someone who was caught stealing and doesn't have with what to repay the fines that he receives when he steals. That we'll talk more about, I think, tomorrow, about these fines and why they are what they are. So the bondman is a Jew who basically has to pay back his debts through his work. And the longest that he can stay on is 50 years, but that's out of his own volition. Really, it's to the point where either he's paid it off or after the sabbatical year, up to 6 years. And after 6 years, if he wants to stay on further, he has to have a sort of like a, in this part of the ear, not in the earlobe, but in the inner part of the ear, he has to have a hole made in that, like people today put jewelry there. So he made that, and he has to have that made by the court. And the court does this, the sages say, in order to tell him that the ear that heard at Mount Sinai, that you shall be my servants, meaning God's, that a person should be a free man. A person should not want to be under the rule of someone else, even monetarily. I was flying on a plane not long ago, and there was an Israeli woman or an ex-Israeli woman who was sitting next to me, and she asked me, why doesn't the Torah talk about the importance of free will? And I said, what do you mean? The first commandment says, I am Havaya, your God, who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. What does he mean by that? He means, I took you out to be free people. The Torah feels that a person has to always be responsible for his own actions. He should be free. The freedom is the requirement, the first requirement, the first basis, the first foundation upon which the whole Torah stands. Not only that, but when we think about mitzvot, the whole point is that if we had no free will, they would be meaningless. They would be like a robot doing something. So God has to build free will into the world, and by building free will into it, he also allowed us to do evil of our own accord, what we decide to. And sometimes people say, how could God stand by and let certain things happen, terrible things that happen around us all the time that have happened in the past? And the simple answer is, God didn't do these terrible things. People decided of their own free will to do these terrible acts. And so someone might say, but how does God stand by and not stop them? But if he would stop them, he would take away the whole basis of what creation is about, which is allowing man to have free will and to be able to pursue his own destiny the way that he sees proper, the way that he sees right, because we understand that only when there's free will is there really meaning to life. So here we have this Jew who owes enough money that he can't pay it back, and he decides to go and become a bondman, a servant who is working basically to pay off his debts. There's an interesting law with this, that if he was not married before this happened to him, only if he was not married, then the person with whom he's working, his master as it were, is allowed to offer him the opportunity to marry, which is not real marriage because she's not a Jew, a non-Jewish servant. And this itself requires a lot of explanation. What does it mean? How do you get a non-Jewish servant in your household? there are two ways of looking at it, and we'll say it quickly. The one way, which is the classical way, and the way most people understand it, it's called a Canaanite servant or a Canaanite slave. And there, these people were bought. They were bought in markets. That's the classical understanding. And they would be servants forever in a household. Except that we know the Jews don't do that. So the correct understanding is probably different. And the correct understanding is that there were non-Jews who were not certain whether they wanted to convert or not. They knew about Judaism, they knew about what Torah was in rudimentary terms, but in order to convert, you have to live with Jews for a while. And some people didn't have the means to pick up and move to a Jewish city and live there for the amount of time required. What's the amount of time? 12 months. This is actually what's demanded today of converts also. That if you want to convert, you have to live within a Jewish community for at least 12 months to see the cycle of the whole year and then decide. So there were many non-Jews at the time who lived in the land of Israel, actually, and they didn't live in a wholly Jewish area. And so in order to see what Judaism was and to live with the Jewish family, they accepted upon themselves the status of a Canaanite slave, is what it's called. And so there would be non-Jewish women sometimes trying to escape their homes, a worse situation and so on, that would join Jewish households in this way. And then this indentured servant, this bondman, had the opportunity to be with such a woman, to live with her. But she wasn't Jewish yet. After a year, she had to decide what she wanted to do. Did she want to remain in her non-Jewish status and continue living with the family? Or did she want to become a full-fledged Jew and convert? In order to become a full-fledged Jew and convert, all she had to do was perform one mitzvah. One mitzvah. The same thing by a male. All he had to do was, what they would do was, it's a very nice thing, is like a bar mitzvah. They would take them to shul, and they would call them up to the Torah. And that was the mitzvah that they performed, reading in the Torah or just saying the blessing, and they were now a Jew. That was the whole conversion, because they had gone to the mikveh before in order to live with their family. So anyway, we have the situation that a non-married bondman, non-married Jewish bondman, can choose to set up a pseudo household with this non-Jewish woman, but the offspring are not his, meaning they're not considered his children. This is no different than any Jew who is with a non-Jewish woman and they have children. The children are not considered his, they're considered her children because they're not Jewish. If they want to join the Jewish people, they have to fully convert because they're not considered to be Jews. This is one of the sources from which we learn that Judaism goes after the mother. So there was this opportunity that he had to not to live by himself, that he could live with a Canaanite slave like this, a woman who was a Canaanite, who wasn't Jewish, and that allowed him to set up his house until the time that he was released. And when he was released from his bond, then he couldn't take her with her unless, of course, she converted. And if she converted, she was now his full-fledged wife. And again, this is only by someone who was not married before he entered into the state of being a bondman. The other interesting law that we have is a young girl who is, here it sounds like she becomes a maidservant. But really she's also a bondmaid. The reason this was used was because in those times, if a family was very poor, it was very hard for them to come up with a dowry. So what was done, this was a practice, as long as the girl was under the age of 12, she had to be under the age of 12. Under the age of 12, you can't do this. She had to be under the age of 12. She could go to work for a wealthy family. And then the wealthy family had three options. At the time, polygamy was allowed. So it could be that the father of the household will take her as his wife when she reached 12 years old. The other option was, and this was the preferred option, was that the father would marry her to one of his sons. And that was her dowry. So her dowry was the work that she had put in before she was 12. The third option was if she reached already the age of 12, he had to set her free, he had to let her go, and more importantly, he had to pay her for all the time that she had worked, and that became her dowry as she went back to her home, and now she had money. So it was basically a way to set up a legal system in which it was impossible for a girl to not receive a dowry for the work that she had done. The final thing in our second reading is the famous eye for an eye, which is talked about a lot. So first of all, this is a good opportunity to understand how Torah works. In the Talmud, in Baba Kama, in the 8th chapter, there's a whole discussion about how do we know that eye for an eye is monetary and it's not actual. And there's 5, 6 different proofs that are brought. But really, the Talmud rejects all the proofs. It says all these proofs I can show you that they're not correct. They have a problem in their the reasoning is right, but the verses don't support them. So why in the end don't we do an eye for an eye like the Muslims do, for instance? The reason is very simple, because the Torah is built out of 2 parts. The one part is what we call the written Torah. The other part is what we call the oral Torah. And orally we received from Moses, from the time that he was on Mount Sinai, that these verses should not be understood literally. The only way to enact them in court is monetarily. And so all the attempts to prove that this is what the verses are saying don't really amount to much, because we have it on tradition that this is how these verses should be understood. And this is very important. What it's saying is that Jewish tradition is many times much stronger than even what the literal meaning of the Torah is. Still, the question arises, so why did the Torah say it this way? Why did it say an eye for an eye and so on, in a misleading way, as it were? So in Kabbalah and Chassidut, there's an explanation that a person should know that even if he hurt someone by mistake, he didn't mean it, and he caused him a damage to a limb, he should know that in the heavens they count it as if he lost his own limb. It's very serious. It's true that here on earth, we don't make reparations that way. We don't take away his eye if he put out someone else's eye. But the person should know that the wholeness of the body is very much considered above. And even if by mistake you hurt someone, above it's considered as if you lost that own part of your body. That own part of your body doesn't function as well spiritually as it did before. So that's a little bit about the first and second readings, and God willing, we'll continue tomorrow at the same time with the third reading. Thank you very much for joining. Have a good day, everyone.